Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this breakout session, which is the cost of clean water. And we're going to be talking about an issue that is of deep concern to all of us. And our panelist, I'll introduce him in just a moment. I'm Penny Gross. I am going to be the moderator. I was supposed to be moderating a panel. It's hard to moderate one other person. Delegate Hodges advised us last night that he would not be here. And so we have just one person who's going to make a presentation, but that means we have more time for discussion. Before we start the presentation, you will have an evaluation form there in the back. Please fill them out. This is how we know that what goes well and what doesn't necessarily go so well in the way of our topics for our annual conferences. So I remember I was pulling out some notes to prepare for this, and I thought, oh my heavens, I was a panelist in this group last year. I have an easy job this time, and that's just to be the moderator. And so I would like very much to introduce to you Delegate David Bulova from the 37th Delegate District, that is Fairfax City and Fairfax, portions of Fairfax County. He was first elected to the General Assembly in November of 2005 and currently serves on the General Laws, Education, and Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committees. He's a member of the State Water Commission, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, the Housing Commission, the Joint Commission on Healthcare, and the Virginia War Memorial Board. He has a laundry list of other things that he does, but the important thing is that he is really a go-to person at the General Assembly on water. Prior to his election to the House of Delegates, he was an elected representative of the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District from 2003 to 2005. He has a BA from the College of William and Mary, a master's in public administration from Virginia Tech, and is a graduate of the Sorensen Institute. Beyond that, he's been a friend for a long, long time. I think, David, I've known you for at least 22 years, since I first got elected, and was able to work with you, and you were staff at the Regional Commission. So David has a broad range of interest and expertise, and he's going to talk to us about stormwater. David?
All right, so a quick question. If I don't use the mic, can you hear me in the back? Does my voice project?
Yeah.
Great.
I'm deaf, I can hear you.
All right. Well, first of all, really am pleased to be here and looking forward to spending the next hour or so talking about Chesapeake Bay issues and stormwater management in particular. I've already gotten some feedback as I was sitting up here, and so I know I'm going to get some good, tough questions, which is great because stormwater management is very important, and yet we come from a very diverse state, and so we want to make sure that we're hearing all those different voices of concern as we make policy for the Commonwealth of Virginia. I also want to say thank you very much. I know oftentimes the General Assembly doesn't make it easy for you. We keep you on your toes. I also realize that when it comes to paying for Chesapeake Bay restoration and stormwater management, notwithstanding what we might put out there in terms of funding, you all are going to be picking up or have already picked up the lion's share of what it takes to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. As Penny mentioned, I actually come from more of a local government background, and so I appreciate what you all are doing and really want to thank you. So I wanted to split up kind of the formal part of this into two parts. And when I say formal, I mean I've got slides. So feel free to jump in and ask questions as I go along. And if we get wrapped around something too much, we'll move it forward and save the discussion for the end of the meeting. But I wanted to really quickly kind of go through where we are with the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, because we're at a very critical time with respect to that restoration effort. There's a lot of very important components that are being decided right now that will carry us forward to our 2025 compliance deadline. And then I'm going to wrap up on changes at the General Assembly and what kind of legislation you might expect to see coming up in the next session. I do wish that Delegate Hodges was here. He and I get along very well. We work together. We don't always have the exact same perspective, but we understand the importance of these issues. There are a couple issues that I know he's been working on that I've been paying attention to, so I will try to do Delegate Hodges justice and present those as well as I can. So as far as the first part of the presentation, I really wanted to give a brief overview of how we are doing with respect to meeting our 2025 deadline for restoring the Chesapeake Bay under the EPA mandate. More importantly, whether that is actually translating into water quality improvement, and then what is there left between now and 2025 that we really need to focus on. And so that's going to be kind of the way I want to approach this. It is always good to kind of back up and remind ourselves why we are doing this. And so restoring the Chesapeake Bay is very important, but it is also about making sure that we do justice by our local water resources. And so Penny might recognize this picture. Penny, do you know where that is?
That's probably down Delaware Bay area.
Close. This is actually the Occoquan Reservoir, which is between Fairfax County and Prince William County. It is one of their major water supplies. This is the reservoir back in 1980, and this is not a St. Patrick's Day prank gone awry. That is actually a massive algal bloom that happened pretty frequently for the Occoquan Reservoir. And this was before the county upgraded the Upper Occoquan Sewage Treatment Authority, and it was before they put in stormwater management for the Occoquan watershed. You don't see this happening anymore, and so it's really a testament to the fact that these practices do work and they do have local benefits. This is a stream in the town of Vienna. It could really be a stream almost anywhere in Virginia. And so it gives you really an idea of how the destructive power of increased volume and velocity of stormwater coming from urban and suburban development have really devastated a lot of our local streams. And so not only is that area really unfit for a lot of our aquatic species, you will also see that a lot of infrastructure is actually washing downstream. Those are actually pieces of stormwater pipe. And all that sediment, of course, goes right down into your local rivers and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. So those are things that we're working on. And then, of course, there's the fact that the Chesapeake Bay is worth a lot to our economy. I think it's worth it just to be able to have my children be able to enjoy oysters and crabs. But the simple fact is that it's a huge economic resource. And notwithstanding how much it's costing us to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, it will pay off in multiple times with respect to what a clean Chesapeake Bay provides to our economy. So anyways, I just wanted to start off with that. So how are we doing with our targets? So we've been working on this for a couple years now. And of course, as you recall, the EPA took this from being a voluntary program and turned it into a regulatory program with a court decision around the 2010 timeframe. But we're making some really good progress. And I love this chart because it shows you all the progress we've made since 1985. And so for phosphorus pollution, we're actually ahead of our target. So we've met our 2017 goals. That's great. We're well on our way to the 2025 target. It's important to recognize where those reductions are coming from. So up here at the top, that's wastewater treatment. We've made huge strides in our wastewater treatment facilities. And down here is agriculture. And as you can see, we actually had some increases in agriculture after a couple of years, but as Virginia's BNP cost share program has really kicked in, we're starting to see some pretty tangible gains, and that's very exciting. Very similar story for nitrogen pollution. A little bit more challenging for sediment. And so we haven't quite met our 2017 targets yet. These are 2016 numbers, so everybody keep your fingers crossed that we're going to get there. But you'll notice that the big difference here is that we don't have wastewater treatment facilities to rely on. So they're a source of nitrogen, they're a source of phosphorus, they're not a source of sediment. And so again, that's one of the struggles with sediment is that we rely more on ag and urban in order to meet those reductions. So is it making a difference? So, that's on paper how well we're doing. The real test is, are our streams responding? And so the good news is that they actually are. And so this is monitoring, this is actual water quality monitoring that has occurred in the Potomac River watersheds, and so we've got some Marylanders in there, as well as our Virginia watersheds. And so this is really important. Now, as a side note, you might have heard about the debate at the national level with respect to should we continue to fund the Chesapeake Bay program. I think there's about $73 million at stake. If you ask yourself, what does that $73 million go to? It primarily goes to that monitoring and modeling network. And so one of the things that we shifted to, and I think is very important, is that we want to ground our decision-making in actual science. And so if we don't have that monitoring network out there, we're kind of flying blind as far as whether we're actually achieving. So that's why that federal money is so important. But for phosphorus, you can see we're doing really well. Every single watershed except one in the Maryland part of the Potomac and then in the Virginia watersheds is actually making progress. Nitrogen, generally making progress. It's a little tougher, and so you're seeing some areas where we're not making as much, but overall we are making some good progress. And then sediment, a little bit more of a mixed bag, but again, we're moving in the right direction. What's really exciting is that we've got a couple places where we're seeing just enormous reductions in sediment pollution. Those are not urban areas, those are agricultural areas where we've really seen a focus on agricultural BMPs. And so it shows the efficacy that those things actually are working, and it's working to the extent that you can see the difference in the actual monitoring in the streams. And then finally, what are the challenges that we have ahead? And so this is a really critical graph, and this is Chesapeake Bay wide, but it's representative of Virginia. And so you can see that watershed wide, we still have about 50 million pounds of nitrogen to go. And so I picked nitrogen. It's similar for phosphorus, similar for sediment. That doesn't tell you much, but this is the one that tells you a whole heck of a lot. And so of that remaining amount, almost zero is going to come from wastewater treatment facilities. We've pretty much maxed those out. We're at level of technology that we can get out of those. And so making up that last bit of difference, we're going to be relying on agriculture. About 71% of that reduction is going to come from agriculture, and about 24% is going to be coming from urban stormwater. The nice thing about wastewater treatment is it's cost efficient, and you know exactly what you're getting from it. You can monitor what's coming out of a wastewater treatment facility. These are not as cost efficient, and you have to maintain these things, and it's harder to be able to tell whether you're making a difference. So there's a lot of challenges with that.
Well, you invited us to chime in.
Yeah.
I'm an oyster farmer, and do you all have any metrics on what oyster aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture is doing in Chesapeake Bay?
In terms of the health of the fishery?
Nitrification, phosphorus sequestration, I mean, it's huge.
Yeah.
200 oyster farmers in Virginia now.
Yep.
And I don't think anybody's invested the money or the trouble in measuring that.
Yeah, and I don't have that information off the top of my head, but the Chesapeake Bay program and the Chesapeake Bay Commission do collect and analyze that kind of information. And so afterwards, if you want me to get you in touch,
Dr. Newell at the University of Maryland was doing a lot of similar work 15 years ago. I presented on this to the Chesapeake Bay Commission in 2001.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing anything. If we're, I'm trying to solve the problem here. I'm not getting on a soapbox. But I do think that if we took that seriously and generated a metric as to what these, actually, you're denitrifying the oyster, takes nitrogen, strips the molecule off and turns it into a nitrogen gas. I mean, this is science, I'm not.
Yes.
So if we were doing that, I think that we would be much better. In reality, we're much better off than where we think we are if we're not accounting for this. So
yeah, great question, and I know I've sat through presentations on that issue. How deep in the weeds and how much information is being collected, I don't know. So I'd love to follow up with you. Sure.
David, on that, I'm sorry, on that particular point, is that something that VIMS would do some of that
well,
study?
the difficulty is actually measuring. We know it's happening.
Yes, we do.
And we you know, with everybody, we're taking aquariums out and showing the kids,
Yeah.
you know, what that oyster's filtering 30 to 50 gallons of water. But in terms of the actual measurement, the measurements break two ways. First, we can measure and do measure that which is bioaccumulated in the animal. We incinerate them and then we measure that. But that's a fraction of what is actually taking place. And
I guess from what at the executive council meeting in Annapolis, there was a lot of celebration because the bay was in such better shape than it had been. But we talk about the return of fisheries and the return of oysters and crabs and so forth. But what you're talking about is actually trying to find a metric on that rather than just talking about the number of oysters or the number of crabs. We're looking at what those oysters are doing.
There's a factor that can go with each oyster, but Penny, the issue is that those oysters are filter feeders.
Yes, they are.
They take that out and they pull the nitrogen and the phosphorus, they absorb and accumulate what they can use, and then they expel the rest. And if that filters down into that black sediment at the bottom, there's a bacteria in there that's stripping. He serves as a catalyst, and he's stripping a molecule off, which, and I'm not a chemist or a biologist, but it's well recognized. I can tell it, you know, I can talk to any professor, and he says, oh yeah, no, it's basic stuff. But what happens is you're turning that dissolved nitrogen solid into a nitrogen gas, which is a large component, a naturally occurring component of our atmosphere.
And without extending this too much, it may be also something, you know, I'm on the local government advisory committee, the Chesapeake Executive Council. This may actually be something for staff from the Science and Technology Advisory Committee to do that, because that sounds like something that staff can really get involved in.
So I know STAC, but also check with the Chesapeake Bay Commission, because we have had presentations on the science and the chemistry involved, and how that adds up, what's the actual end.
The name Roger Newell, he's been the guy that's done the seminal work on that. He's the guy that figured out the calculation that the entire volume of the estuary was filtered every 3 to 5 days back when we had.
Yes, back when we had more
Yes, ma'am.
oysters, but it may be something for staff to take a look at. Thank you, I will
Yes, ma'am,
jot
my
that
pleasure.
down.
And it does make my heart break, and I understand the scientific reason when you said that you would incinerate an oyster rather than eat it, but.
Well, we burn people.
Can I speak for the clam?
We got something here from the crowd.
I'm from Northampton County. I live on the bay. I watched it for 40 years, okay? Survey of one. It's a lot better. A lot better. But we, on the eastern shore, and throughout the watershed, I think people get the idea sometimes that Jack and I are against controls, against erosion sediment. I mean, you know, we're not. We live off clean water. We have to have clean water. Agriculture in Northampton County is one of our top 3. So I think we need to include clams in there as well, because
And shellfish.
and shellfish, because they clean as well.
Yep, very good. All right, so in terms of where we are today, we are at a really critical juncture. So there's something called the 2017 Midpoint Assessment, and that's when the EPA and all the stakeholders get together and they take a look at how the monitoring and the modeling all fit together and whether we're on track. And so right now we're supposed to have met 60% of our targets going to 2025. At the end of this month is when the EPA will release those draft targets for each major watershed in the Chesapeake Bay. And so that'll be kind of your first glimpse of whether we are right on target, whether we're ahead, whether we're behind, whether we need to do more, whether we can do less. I doubt that, but it's going to be a good indication of what's going on and what the challenges are ahead. So that'll get released. It'll be finalized in May. And then it really is up to the states to figure out how do they allocate those targets, those load reductions, among all of potential sources. And so if you're familiar with the watershed implementation plan process, they're going to look and say, all right, how much of this are we going to assign to our urban sector? How much are we going to assign to our agricultural sector? How much are we going to assign to septics? And then develop a plan around that. And so from there on out, whether it's regulations, whether it is your MS4 permits for your urban areas, whether it is your BPS permits for CAFOs, All of those things are going to be driven by what that process says and how the state develops that WIP. So super important. There are a couple critical decision points that are being made right now, which will feed into or are feeding into that December release. And so it's important to kind of understand what those are, and I'll go through it really quick. This is the Conowingo Dam. Some of you might understand why this is important. Others are saying, why on earth would you put a dam up there that's located on the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland? Well, the reason is because up until a couple years ago, we were assuming that was operating just like a giant stormwater management facility. It was great, and it was. It was trapping a lot of sediment, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus behind that dam. Well, the darn thing filled up ahead of schedule. And so now all that stuff that we thought was going to be held back on the Susquehanna, it's going straight over the dam, right into the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a really big debate about how do we address that, because politically Pennsylvania is already struggling with how do they pay for this, how do they convince their farmers that they ought to be doing their part to protect the Chesapeake Bay when they don't even border on it. And so those decisions are being right now as far as how that's going to be allocated. Climate change, something that wasn't anticipated in the original model, but certainly affects the way that the Chesapeake Bay responds to nitrogen and phosphorus. And so what's interesting is that if you have increased precipitation, you have heavier deluges, more intense storms, you have higher temperatures, they affect the estuary and the watershed, so your bay and your local streams in different ways. And so they need to model that and anticipate how climate change might affect the Chesapeake Bay over time. And then there's accounting for growth. And I guess this is the one that I had a hard time wrapping my head around, was that the original model didn't do a really good job of anticipating growth in the watershed. And yet this is a very important one for Virginia, because I think if I remember my numbers correctly, between now and 2040, Virginia is going to grow by another 2 Fairfax counties. So imagine that we are going to have to absorb enough population that you could have 2 more Fairfax counties plop down in Virginia. And so it's a big deal. How do you go ahead and figure that out?
Sure, you know.
Are you willing to do it? So those are some of the critical decision points that they're working their way through. The things that really keep me up at night are actually a little bit more basic, and they should keep you up at night as well. And so how many urban localities do we have here that have MS4 permits? A couple over here. Okay, so for those of you who have MS4 permits, you've already developed your Chesapeake Bay TMDL action plans. They've been approved by the Department of Environmental Quality. Many localities have taken a lot of credit for street sweeping, and they've taken a lot of credit for stormwater management facilities that were installed between 2006 and 2009. In fact, locality gets to take 100% credit for those facilities. And in fact, by taking credit for those two things, there are several localities, urban localities, that almost have to do nothing. Some of them have actually met their goals already. Now, we of course haven't restored the Chesapeake Bay, so it begs the question about whether DEQ and the state's going to be forced to come back and say, yeah, we gave you credit for those things, now we're going to have to give you less credit for those things, and we'll actually put you behind. Unregulated urban areas. And this affects anybody who has any kind of urban area within your jurisdiction. And so remember, the only way that the state can force you to make reductions, as opposed to just development, is if you've got a permit. So again, if you have an MS4 permit, which was considered to be contiguous with an urban area. Well, our urban areas have done a very nice job of actually narrowing down what they're responsible for. Because under the EPA, it says you're responsible for anything that goes into your stormwater pipes. And DEQ and EPA have kind of overestimated what that area is that is considered urban and regulatable. Stafford County is a great example. They had a really big urban area that they thought was going to be regulated. I think they've gotten that down to maybe 100 acres. And so what you have is a lot of orphaned urban area where the localities aren't responsible. So who is responsible? Well, ultimately, it's kind of all of us. And so either somebody has to step up to the plate and manage that, or the reductions have to get spread out to everybody else in order to achieve. VDOT didn't do us any favors, nor in my estimation to DEQ, because they actually treated VDOT a little differently in terms of their MS4 area. And it left a lot of stranded impervious area that VDOT otherwise would have been responsible for that now nobody is. So localities aren't responsible for it yet, but it's kind of sitting out there. They'll need to get controlled sooner or later. And then there's the last one, which is a new EPA requirement that sets local area planning goals. And so right now, when DEQ put together their watershed implementation plan, they look at sectors. So they say, all right, agriculture, you're going to take this much. Urban areas, you're going to take that much. What they didn't do was assign a goal by jurisdiction or by geography. But that's what they're going to make us do now. And so EPA is saying, hey, this is just to give us an idea of setting goals in a geography that you can relate to, whether it's a watershed, whether it's a locality. But of course, once you start doing that, you start to have expectations about accountability for actually making those targets and reductions. And so that's why these two are very, very much linked. All right, so if you've got orphaned urban stormwater runoff, now all of that is going to get lumped into this one big geographic goal that EPA says is not there to be regulated, but you've now identified what everybody's targets are. And so you kind of start thinking, what's the next step in all of that? Yeah.
Sir, I saw a preliminary drawing, a graph of this, and where we, in King William County, saw a little bit of problem with this, is that it's not, when you say geographic area, that's what it is, geographic. It doesn't count for all the counties that are in there. And we're struggling with how are we going to get all these counties to work together to meet that goal.
Yeah. And it could be just jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It could be reasonable. Virginia gets to decide at this point. But you're right. Even if Fairfax County was given a particular goal, they don't have the authority to be able to even meet that goal if they wanted to. And yet you are establishing a level of expectation. So again, it's something that I think everybody needs to be cognizant of because it is a shift in the way that EPA is thinking, where they're looking not just at your permit holders or your sectors, but they're thinking about localities or regions.
David?
Yes, sir.
John Weisstadt, Arlington. I got in just a little late, but you may have already addressed this, but in terms of credits and offsets and so forth, one of the things we're struggling with in Arlington as a mature, highly developed county is our tree canopy, which is diminishing. And so we'd like to figure out a way in terms of offsets and so forth, how can we better incentivize developers for tree preservation versus the default position, which is easier, and that's tree planting. Because we know that, okay, even a tree canopy built out over 20 years is not going to come close to the mature trees of 50 and 70 years old for a number of decades down the road. So do you just have any thoughts about that in terms of the relative value and credit we can get for preservation versus planting?
Yeah, and so the Urban Stormwater Work Group, the Chesapeake Bay program, they've done studies as far as the value of tree canopy. And I guess there's two ways to get at it. A couple of years ago, actually, myself and Senator Patsy Ticer passed some legislation that gave localities up in Planning District 8 additional authority or additional tools to conserve or incentivize the conservation of mature tree canopy during the development process. And so I guess the first thing I would check is to see whether Arlington County has availed yourselves of that. I know Fairfax County did, and so you might want to just check and see if Arlington County has done the same thing. Another thing that you might want to look at, and I hate to open up this can of worms, but the way that Arlington County right now pays for your stormwater management program is you have a service district fee. Everybody pays a little extra in order to support the Chesapeake Bay Restoration and Stormwater Management Program, but it's based on the value of your property, not with respect to what you're contributing into the system. And so for localities that have adopted stormwater utilities, where you get charged based on the amount of impervious cover and what you've done on your property to mitigate stormwater runoff, you can actually provide credits and incentives to conserve tree canopy. And so again, if you're looking for a voluntary way of getting developers to do that, shifting the way that you raise revenue for stormwater management and Chesapeake Bay protection might be one option for doing that.
Okay, I'll follow up. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are you also looking at, again, I've heard a little bit about what happened in New York city and the Appalachian areas or the areas out there, when there were about pollution credits or offsets. And for instance, King William has a lot of trees, whereas one of the other areas has few trees. And what I've heard is that the other area that has few trees can buy or take a lease on the areas that have trees and use those as an offset.
Yeah. And so Virginia's been very proactive with respect to nutrient credit trading. Now you actually have to create value. And so what you actually have in a lot of rural areas is that you will take land, you'll convert it from agriculture to wetland or forest, but because you've done that, you are creating value with respect to nutrients, and then you can sell that to urban areas to offset it.
Yes.
It was actually something that was highlighted by the EPA administrator 2 or 3 years ago as something that Virginia was really leading the charge on. And so that infrastructure exists, and it's just a matter of making sure that it's taken advantage of. You can't do it for water volume because the impacts are very, very local, but there are mechanisms for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, Virginia's been a real leader on that. And I think overall, it's helped localities to better manage, how we are going to achieve our reduction goals. All right, so wanted to wrap up with what you can expect for the 2018 General Assembly session. And if I had given this presentation a week ago, it would have been slightly different because you're going to see some big changes in the House of Delegates in particular. Now, one thing that was going to happen regardless is that we are going to have a new Secretary of Natural Resources. And so I've had the opportunity to work with Molly Ward these last 4 years. I think she's great. I think she is a good listener, works very hard. But over the next month or so, we're going to see somebody else in there as our new Secretary of Natural Resources. They'll bring their own style, they'll bring their own priorities and their own different perspective. The real big changes, though, are with respect to the makeup of your committee system. And so, for instance, most of these bills, legislation will go through the House Ag Chesapeake and Natural Resources Committee. So already we had 2 members who were not returning. One retired, one wasn't reelected. But the important thing is that in the House, your committees are set up by proportionality. Right? So it's supposed to be and is a reflection of how many Democrats and Republicans are in the House. And so right now, the current split is 15 Republicans and 7 Democrats. So let's assume, because we have a couple of locality or districts that are still on the recount, you've got 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats. So all of a sudden now you've got 12 to 10 split. That changes the dynamics dramatically. Or if there's an even split, you got a power sharing agreement that you got to work out. And I'm not quite sure how the heck that's going to work. But it certainly makes things much more interesting and complicated. And you got the same issue for every committee that's out there, including the Appropriations Committee that's going to have to deal with that. Budget items. And so before I came down here, I had a quick chat with one of our Appropriations Committee members, just to make sure that I was getting the latest. And depending on whether you want to be positive or negative, we are going to have modest growth in revenue. I've also heard anemic growth in revenue. I like modest a little bit better than anemic. But there's also going to be a lot of demands. And so you all represent localities, you all understand. So we've got educational re-benchmarking for K through 12. That's going to be a lot of resources. You got Medicaid, notwithstanding anything dealing with expansion, Medicaid is going to require some significant new resources. So the word is that it's going to be pretty tight. And so there's not going to be a lot of room for additional resources. 2 areas where there is discussion on. So Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. So for urban areas, this has been very, very important. Last year saw 41 projects at about $19.8 million. We are hoping that the governor's introduced budget will have some money in there for Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. If it doesn't, I have heard from a couple of folks that perhaps it will be included in a bond package similar to how we funded it in 2015. So kind of keep watching that space. The thing is that there's other potential demands on the SLAP fund that I'll talk about in just a second, but interest in it is continuing to grow. The other part is agricultural BMP cost share stabilization. So in the budget last year, there was language to put together a work group to look at how do we stabilize money going out towards BMP cost share. And so recommendations are going to be coming out in December. I had a chance to sit on that particular work group, but the idea is that we want to stabilize funds for technical assistance. Administration is relatively stable, but the technical assistance part is linked with the amount of BNP cost share, and so you've got this up and down that's really hard to keep quality technical assistance staff on board. And so we want to make sure that those things are stable, and then establish a baseline of about $35 million per year at BNP cost share. Some of that money, the proposal that's out there is to have the other half of the recordation fee go towards the Water Quality Improvement Reserve Fund, in case you're wondering. So for stormwater management, and so I'm going to pretend that I'm Keith Hodges for a couple seconds. This issue, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but I know that there's a lot of interest, is how do we make sure that we continue progress on stormwater quality in our rural areas, while also recognizing that our rural areas are not as well equipped staffing-wise and economic-wise in order to make some of this work sometimes. And so Fairfax County, Penny, how many people do you figure are on the staff of environmental services that do stormwater management?
Some in excess of 50.
50? Okay. There are some rural localities that will only have 1 or 2 projects per year. And so how do you balance that? And the other issue is that in our rural areas, you've got much sandier soil, it's much flatter, and so if you try to keep the water on site, you sometimes cause flooding problems, which is an unintended consequence. So there's a work group that was put together that Delegate Hodges was very, very involved in. My understanding is that they've got 3 things that they're going to be proposing out of that. The first one is to allow localities to accept stormwater management plans sealed by a licensed PE in lieu of a local plan review for those projects between 2,500 square feet and 1 acre. And so that kind of gets at the staffing issue for some of these very small projects and allows the PE to basically be able to do that as a one-stop shop. The next one is to allow localities in Tidewater to have a tiered approach to stormwater management. And so in talking with some of the localities that are much more familiar and comfortable with making work the old stormwater requirements under NS 19. And so what they're proposing is that if you've got a watershed that is less than 7.5% impervious cover, and that's kind of the point at which a watershed starts to have an impact on local water resources from an impervious standpoint, that you can use those old standards, again, for those relatively small projects. And so I think the idea is that you're recognizing from a technical standpoint and a funding standpoint that that will still work. And then the last one, and this is one I have kind of mixed feelings about, is creating a stormwater local assistance fund, sub-fund for roadside ditch maintenance. And so this is something that has a lot of promise with respect to being a water quality BMP. It is still being examined by the Chesapeake Bay program in terms of how much benefit you have. My concern is not bifurcating the local assistance fund so that we got a separate fund for this and we got a separate fund for bioretention. The idea of the fund is to make sure that all of them compete together and you're getting your best bang for your buck. But those are essentially what Delegate Hodges has laid out there. I think he's done a really good job of trying to bring all the stakeholders together, and we'll see how that flies going into the session. Yes, sir?
Question, loaded question.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Now, the gentlemen in Arlington and Fairfax and the urban built-up areas, they legitimately have an impervious and stormwater runoff problem. Mm-hmm. A tree in Fairfax, Northern Virginia, may be worth several $1 million if it's a nice, big, large specimen tree. Right? But, you know, us folks that are very rural, west of Richmond, up on Piedmont, where our impervious area is probably less than 1/100th of 1% of our area. And we've got plenty of trees and wide open spaces. Why are we forced to deal with the economic persecution that comes with this? You know, you're 2,500 square feet, you know, we're still under a 10,000 square foot rule in Buckingham. But that's less than 1/4 of an acre. I mean, a young family starting out can't even legally set up a double-wide trailer, which is all they can afford, and have a yard with a well and septic area cleared without hiring a PE to develop them an erosion and sediment control plan, when what runs off of their area is going to run into the woods next door, and it's not going to make it off their property. Why should we even have to be concerned about it whatsoever? Because when we do get an opportunity for some type of entrepreneurial enterprise to come in, the very first thing that they do is they go talk to the engineers and they inform them of all these environmental things they're going to have to do. If they've got a little gully there and they want to fill it up, then they've got emergent streamlands, they've got to buy credits, and they just say, to hell with this, we're not going to fool with it. And nothing gets developed. What's the benefit to us in the rural areas for putting up with this?
Well, thank you for the question, and I appreciate it. And I guess what I would say in response is, number one, we all deeply benefit from clean water in our local streams and with respect to the Chesapeake Bay.
We can't make enough mess to dirty our streams up.
Well, but urban areas have the same problem, which is death by 1,000 cuts. And so, any particular lot, is it going to be the end of the world for your stream, end of the world for the Chesapeake Bay? No. But what we have seen is that if you don't control project after project, you do have a cumulative impact. Now, I understand and I support efforts to streamline that process and not make it arduous or overly complicated. And so I think that's what Delegate Hodges is trying to do, is how do we make sure that we're protecting our streams in the Chesapeake Bay while also making sure that the process is not unnecessarily complicated so that you have to spend that much money.
I've dealt with it in the trenches, and it is unnecessarily arduous and complicated. And the death by 1,000 cuts, we don't have enough development to make 4 or 5 cuts, much less 1,000 to kill us.
David, if you could maybe finish, I know you've got just a couple more slides, and then we can open up to questions, because I'd like to get through the...
I'll run through these very quickly. They're great questions, and I don't care if they're loaded or not. They're genuine. I appreciate it. So as far as on the Stormwater Management Act, if you liked that one, you're going to love this one. A couple different things that I've seen bubble up with respect to potential things to the Stormwater Management Act that might change. So there's a great deal of attention to maintenance of stormwater management facilities. And so I know a couple of folks at least anticipate that they might put some bills in that would require localities to expend more resources to ensure that private stormwater facilities are indeed being maintained. So again, it doesn't make much sense to put them in if they're not being maintained for the long term. So, how do you walk that fine line of ensuring they're maintained without costing too much for the locality? But that's something that is at least being actively discussed. For those of you who have stormwater utilities, and again, this is just another way of raising revenue. It's based on impervious cover as opposed to the property value. Each year there's a couple of different bills that try to take away some authority of localities to do that. I haven't seen anything for this year, but it's important. We put you all in the position of having to raise money for this. You all should have the tools to be able to do it based on what you feel is the right way, not to be micromanaged by the General Assembly. And then finally, there's the consolidation that we did in 2016 of the Erosion and Sediment Control Act and the Stormwater Management Act. And the idea, getting to kind of your point, was why do we have 2 pieces of regulations out there? Let's try to put them together, make them work better for the developer and also for the locality. That was delayed last year until 2018. For those localities here who have stormwater management ordinances, it might require you to go back in and tweak those to make sure that those 2 programs are working well together. So two last things. One is a really innovative program that I wanted to highlight. For those of you who are familiar with the Eastern Shore groundwater management area, you'll recognize that we've been over-withdrawing groundwater for a number of years, and it's gotten to the point where parts of the groundwater aquifer, the Potomac aquifer, on the verge of losing storage capacity forever. That's a really bad thing. Hampton Road Sanitation Authority is proposing something really, really cool, where they are taking their water, they are going to treat it to drinking water standards and actually re-inject that into the groundwater. And if you look at the computer modeling, it's just unbelievable because it actually not just takes care of the issue or keeps it from getting worse, you actually see the groundwater aquifer start to recharge. The neat thing is that because they are over-treating their water, they actually are making some pretty big nutrient reductions that they can now sell on the open market to other people who are struggling. Legislation might be proposed. I think there's concern about making sure there's independent oversight of that operation. And so similar to what we have in Northern Virginia with the Aquaculture Watershed Monitoring Lab, that might be something that's put in place. And then last but not least is environmental education. And I put that in there because environmental education is a really important component of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. And if you're in an urban area and have an MS4 permit, it's a very important component of your MS4 requirements. Last year, due to the budget cuts, the Office of Environmental Education was cut entirely. So saved about $400,000, but there's no more Office of Environmental Education. And so this last year, myself and Delegate Scott Lingenfelter from Prince William put in a request for our Secretary of Education and Secretary of Natural Resources to pull together stakeholders to figure out how do we make education, the delivery of education work on a statewide level. And so we're excited that there's a couple of recommendations coming out of that, including potentially a clearinghouse for environmental curricula and resources that any locality can use so that you're not forced to recreate the wheel with respect to meeting your permit requirements. So that is just a brief overview of what you can expect in the 2018 session and beyond. And more than happy to take as many questions as you can throw at me.
We have about 20 minutes and for questions and discussion. And I think, I saw Mr. Earhart's.
I wanted to help you out, Delegate. Single-family homes don't have to do that. There's a thing in the Code of Virginia called an agreement in lieu of plan. Now, if Buckingham County is making someone do that, you need to talk with your zoning folks, because there's a thing called an agreement in lieu of plan. So basically, the homeowner can do their own plan. They don't have to have a PE design and stuff like that if it meets that small criteria. That's all they need to do. They don't need to develop a full-blown plan because you're out of the stormwater management area. They can do an agreement in lieu of plan for erosion sediment control.
Right. Get me the numbers on that after this is over. I'll investigate and see if our locals are using that.
I knew you looked like a very smart, intelligent person. Very kind, but you're right. That's kind of part of that recognizing, that
But still, my basic premise on it, we have so much home, and we have so much undisturbed area that even a substantial development doesn't come into a percentage of what transpires in y'all's urban paved areas. Why we're persecuted with it at all. We're starving to death for revenue, but we can't get any kind of development because if it gets over 10,000 square feet, then everything still applies.
And it sounds like this is the same discussion we had last year at this particular.
And the year before that.
And the year before that.
Yeah,
It's an ongoing.
And we'll be back next year.
It's an
I'm sure
ongoing
we'll be
issue.
right here next year,
So-
talking about spending $10,000 to $15,000 in engineering to build a $5,000 building.
And I think the agreement in lieu of a plan, so I think you still have to do ENS.
Yeah.
Yes, you do.
But as far as stormwater management requirements, that's actually not 10,000 square feet. I think that's up to an acre, correct?
But David, for your purposes,
Yeah.
in the General Assembly, this is an ongoing issue that has not been resolved to the satisfaction of a lot of our smaller, more rural counties. So it's one of those things that those of us in the urban areas, we hear it, we're trying to figure out, okay, we have to take care of what we do. How does that impact, what they do and vice versa? So this is one of those issues that maybe never gets resolved, but we need to be very aware of it because in Virginia, you've got you know, you've got Northern Virginia, and you've got Tidewater, and you've got the smaller counties in the middle that are all looking at economic development and seeing the requirements stifle their economic development. So it's environment versus economic development, and that's a challenge for us. Sharon, I think has something.
I guess I was just going to say that different parts of the watershed throughout the Commonwealth may contribute in different ways. And in Northern Virginia, more impervious surfaces and small, more urban development. But in other parts of the watershed, it's not so much that, you know, that it's less developed, but it could be agricultural uses that contribute, you know, toward what runs into the watershed. So I guess we contribute, you know, in different ways, but all of us need to kind of do our part. It's not just development, it's, you know, the way we're using the land.
I have 95% of my original wetlands. I have maybe 2% impervious surface area in my county. My county has been called on since 1970 when we started passing environmental regs to do and confer benefit on the nation as a whole, the world. This is your Chesapeake Bay. So my former Senator Ralph Northam, this is your bay. But Matthews County and the counties that are contiguous to the water areas have borne an unnecessarily high price. I have a house in Arlington. I'm one of John's constituents also. Yeah. Second smallest county in Virginia, second smallest county in Virginia. That's where the similarities stop. I could fit my entire budget in what they spend on trash pickup in one day, probably. I'm planning. I'm trying to make an appeal. You brought up an issue with respect to, you know, how you have to do something to derive mitigative status. I've all along argued that for the purposes of some of the Tidewater counties that are, I mean, I'm population 8,086 square miles. We have still some of the most pristine land and water. My oyster operation over 25 years pulled 20 tons of nitrogen out of the water without so much as a thank you. We've sequestered phosphorus, we've sequestered carbon. We do a great deal of education. I have people come to my oyster farm daily and they get the song and dance. But I'm really strongly of the opinion that somehow we have to find a way to offset this. You understand, of course, that there is and I'm jumping around, but there's a status, intensely developed use. I can't put any development on my land, and I have very little development there. But in the District of Columbia, you can build a hotel right up to the waterfront. It's an intensely developed section. For me, I mean, I don't want to sound crass, but it's the gravy sucking pig rule. And you're rewarding the wrong people. And it shouldn't be. We literally are choking for the possibility of development. Two things. One, I would like to find the legislature have mercy on those counties that have suffered from the dearth of economic development. But I think that one solution might be is that we could create and keep these pristine areas and allow just an acre for acre, not create wetlands. We have not create new changes, but just an acre for acre. Let's keep it, let's save it, let's keep it clean in perpetuity, and allow VDOT to use that as a credit rather than flooding and inundating an upland area with water and making it a wetland. And I think that there are other solutions. And I'm sorry that Keith isn't here. We've been working on various issues and things with that.
So you talking about a transfer of development rights kind of?
Well, no, because we're not allowed to develop.
Yeah.
That's the problem. You know, we don't. we can't even think in terms of what happens in other jurisdictions. What I'm thinking is that there are areas that would make sense to keep and protect. They serve huge environmental functions, whether it's buffer, whether it's absorption, whatever. But I don't think that we should have to alter or create anything. I think we've already suffered from 40 years of strict environmental regs in some places. I can't even, we've got an old fish processing place, it's right on the water, beautiful spot. We can't put a restaurant in there because it's not a water-dependent activity. I mean, really? Now, I go across the 14th Street Bridge every week carrying oysters to the DC raw bars, and I'm looking at 20 tower cranes. And I'm thinking, where's the justice in this? And where's the environmental benefit? I've done more to benefit the environment than all of Arlington. Literally.
And I think what he's really pointing out is
Can I echo?
there are a lot of people, and of the type of...
Could I just echo one point? We depend on watermen. Our watermen need to be in, we are under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, and the people in Alexandria don't care about this. We are under that as well as erosion sedimentation controls and everything else. Waterman, like an old oyster house, he wants to expand it and grow more spat, do something. Maybe even create, heaven forbid, create 5 jobs. What in the world would happen if we did that? We can't do it because some DEQ person comes in and says, where are you going to park your construction equipment? If you pull a backhoe over there, that's compaction. I'm telling you guys, and shut up. You need to look at the size of this group. Every year I've been here, it goes down. And I know there's some other good sessions going on, but that's why this group is down. These people are giving up. Delegate Hodges is the only person in the whole House of Delegates trying to do something about this program.
David, I think what we're hearing is everybody is trying to do the right thing for their particular area especially, because as local elected officials, we need to keep our boundaries within our view all the time. That's where we are elected to serve. And so, because we are all trying to do the right thing, there's a tendency sometimes because of the overall issues in the Bay, and the Bay is getting better, absolutely. We're seeing things that are happening now that I never dreamed 20 years ago we would be at this point, that we would actually have some successes. But there seems to be a sense that somebody's blamed for it. And it's not necessary, I mean, it's not the General Assembly, it's not, I think it's the sort of the overall atmosphere. The EPA is, they've got certain things that they're supposed to be doing, and so somebody's got to be guilty of something. And so that when we've got oystermen, we're trying to work for both the industry and recognizing what they need to have that industry, what you need to have those oyster spat, what you need to have in the way of clean water. I remember going to on an LGAC tour down into the Eastern Shore. They had a small farm, oyster farm, out in the shallows of freshwater, sort of the brackish area. And repeated to the group, it's so important that the creek that feeds that be the best water quality you could possibly have, because all you needed was one little glitch and you wiped out all of those beds. And it really brought it home to those of us who are local government advisors from all over the Bay Area, that that's one of the arguments actually in favor of what we're trying to accomplish, is that you need the clean water for your particular thing. Somebody else needs the clean water for something else, but we're all in this together. We need to be aware of what the value of clean water is. How we get there is a challenge.
I mean,
We've got a speaker right here.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
where I'm trying to go is that we are happy to be green. We bought into it. We live there because we want to be there. But from an economic perspective, we're totally dying. And this is rehash ecology. You know, you've got the tobacco region that's seeing money, you've got the coal region that's seeing money. You have this wonderful watershed area that we're basically being called on to confer the benefit on all Americans. Because Chesapeake Bay is a precious resource. And if we could find a way, some creative thoughts and some generosity to make it work, I think all of us would be better off, and that this would not be a dying place, and there would not be pressures to do some of the other things. Just remember that the city of Alexandria, one of the wealthiest jurisdictions in the Commonwealth, has a license to dump 300 million gallons of sewage-laced stormwater into the Potomac River every year. That would never happen in Matthews County.
And they're not going to get to do that very much.
I know, but they got years. So I'm just saying, you know, so I thank you, and I thank you both of you for what you
I
did.
want to make sure that if there's somebody else here that wants to ask a question before you go back to the.
I think what I'm hearing from him is the cure of this situation is killing the patient, which is him. Is that what I'm hearing from Matthews County?
Well, the Chesapeake Bay, and we're winning. I mean, you know, we have a healthy, thriving oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay. We did not have that 20 years ago. We did not have that 10. And what those oysters do naturally, this is the active removal. If we stop all loading into the Chesapeake Bay tomorrow, it would take more than 100 years to make it right itself. The only proactive things we have in the bay are molluscan shellfish and certain filter feeders like menhaden, because they do take these things out of the water. And I was a high-priced Washington environmental attorney. I gave it up to bring back the oyster. And I'm proud of that, and I'm happy to do that. I'm looking for solutions and trying to find a balance. And you hit it on the head when you say we're all serving our own communities, and we don't necessarily look at that impact on how holistic or how the totality of it is. I just want to leave something with you all to think about when you're up in Richmond. And Keith comes to you with an idea that you know, I grew up in Fairfax County. I graduated from Fort Dunn High School. I know Fairfax. I know Alexandria. You know, I found my way home to my ancestral home, and I'll die there. But I'm in it for the good of Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay. But I'm not trying to make trouble if I sound inarticulate.
No, you are very helpful from my perspective. And I don't know about David. David's at a different level than I am. But as a Virginia rep to the Local Government Advisory Committee, these kinds of discussions are so valuable because I can take this back. And that's part of what the Local Government Advisory Committee is supposed to be doing, is advising the Chesapeake Executive Council. But if we only talk to ourselves and not to others, then we are not doing our job. So I appreciate that very much. We probably have time for about one more question. But before we do that, David, could you go back? I'm going to raise a question. I'm going to raise an issue that might not be so comfortable for you, but it's the common.
For them or for me?
For you. Actually, for
Thanks,
all of
Penny.
us. The common.
Former friend Penny Rose.
I want to raise I want to make sure you understand the importance of what they're trying to do with the common go. The Conowingo, you know, a few years ago, the Corps of Engineers, there was a study done that we had plenty of time yet in that basin. It's a 14-mile reservoir, essentially, behind it. And a study said, oh, fine, you know, we've got many years left. Then there was a second study that was done a couple of years ago, and it's like, whoops, we made a mistake, we're full. I think I'm probably accurate. Now, one of the things that Exelon, which owns the bay, the dam is going to do, and they were supposed to start it in October, but I have not heard whether they actually started. They were going to do removal, dredging behind the dam of 25,000 cubic feet, cubic yards, 25,000 cubic yards. That's like this much of a, swimming pool. And see what's in there. What are the legacy sediments in there? What would be the effect of taking that out? And what would they do with all those dredge soils that they pull out? We got to find out what to do with that. I don't know that that's going to have a lot of effect on the overall issues of Conroe because it's such a small amount, but they need to figure it out as a sort of a pilot program. But one of the discussions has been, and Dave, you can probably speak to this better than I, is how to allocate all the loads on the Susquehanna coming down to the Conroe. Should it be a Pennsylvania issue, or should it be distributed among all of the Bay states? And that's where it's, whoops. Should Virginia be responsible for what happens up here?
So this is the intersection of policy and science, folks.
I wanted to go there because we sort of went over it, but that's going to be an important subject of discussion.
Yeah, and so it's very sensitive for Pennsylvanians.
Yes.
Again, it's a conversation similar to what we're having here, which is you have a lot of rural localities who are thinking, why on earth am I doing this? So that those Virginians and Marylanders can enjoy the Chesapeake Bay when I don't get much out of this. And then to have this thrown on them at the last minute, saying, hey, what you were doing and what you were planning on, what we told you you had to do before 2025, well, it's going to be a little bit more than that. And so Pennsylvania's kind of pushed back and said, hey, look, guys, if we're all in this together, can we share some of the hurt? And so again, the problem is that once you do that, you're actually taking some of the science out of the equation, which bothers me, but you throw it into the politics. Now, my understanding, and it doesn't go beyond this room, is that kind of the preferred approach is that it would be a shared Maryland, Pennsylvania, Exelon issue, just because we're actually lucky that...
New York should be in there also.
And I think New York might be in there. But the problem is we aren't where you get the most bang for your buck on the remaining loads. And so, if Virginia was to take up some of that slack, it'd actually be much more costly for us to do that. So from an economic sense, it doesn't make much sense to do that. But you've got all three governors kind of duking it out at multiple levels to figure out where we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that even though it's a long way away from Virginia, it's a significant impact on the Bay and on all of us who are downstream.
Think of it as a construction site. It's basically a huge sediment trap that's filled up and ready to go.
And the interesting piece of this is that it's not just the two states, but you've got a public utility involved also that has some responsibility. And people have said, just get rid of the dam, blow it up. What good is it? It provides all the hydroelectric power for Philadelphia and the environment. There's no, as far as I understand, there's no hydroelectric dam on the East Coast like this one. We have a lot of them in the West, but not in the East. So it's also sort of a different thing that people are trying to get their arms around. But on that, I just want to bring that to your attention, and let's thank David Bulova for his presentation.
I do want to just say really quickly that this is about making the changes necessary to protect the Bay, but it's also about doing no harm. But to the earlier point, which is that you don't want to kill the patient in the process, that's very important to me. I want to make sure that the economies of those localities succeed. I want to make sure that those watermen are in business for a long time and they are thriving. And so to the degree that we can make that happen, consider me to be a resource just like Delegate Hodges.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget your